I thought I was just messing around with the guards, but when they grab you by the shoulder and drag you into a police car, you realize maybe jokes like that aren't so funny after all. What happened next? You wouldn't believe how quickly it spiraled, but let's start with how it all went down. So here's the thing about Ryan. He's 25, hails from Chicago, and considers himself a connoisseur of adventure. You know the type, the guy who's always got a wild story, most of which end with, "And then I barely got out of there alive." After years of scrimping, saving, and telling anyone who listened that he was going to do something epic, he finally booked himself a ticket to London. His goal? To touch history, whatever the heck that means. Now, on this rare sunny day in London, no joke, the weather was practically taunting its reputation, Ryan found himself standing outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists were swarming the gates like moths to a flame, snapping pictures, oohing and aahing, and generally behaving like they'd never seen a fancy building before. And then there was Ryan, with his signature smirk and a swagger that screamed, "I'm about to do something dumb." That's when he spotted them, the Royal Guards, decked out in their red uniforms and those absurdly tall, fuzzy hats. "Serious dudes in funny hats," Ryan muttered to himself, a grin spreading across his face. To him, they were less symbols of tradition and more targets. Without wasting a second, he decided he'd be that guy. You know, the one who thinks he's hilarious for trying to make a guard laugh or move or, I don't know, break character. Ryan started with the classics, waving his arms, pulling faces, cracking jokes loud enough for the surrounding tourists to hear. And oh, the crowd was eating it up. Phones were out, people were chuckling, and Ryan was living for the attention. Feeling emboldened, he stepped closer to one of the guards. "Come on, mate, just blink or something," he teased, leaning in like he was whispering some kind of secret. The guard didn't flinch. Ryan, however, wasn't about to let his newfound audience down. He leaned in closer, then gave the guard a quick, playful jab on the shoulder. Cue the collective gasp. The crowd went silent for about half a second, then broke into whispers and murmurs. Ryan, being Ryan, just grinned wider, soaking it all in. He even gave the crowd a little bow, like he'd just performed a magic trick. But his triumph was short-lived. The guard, who'd been still as a statue the entire time, suddenly turned his head, his voice cut through the air like a knife. "Step back, sir." It wasn't a request. Ryan froze. For a split second, the smirk slipped from his face. But before he could even process the warning, he instinctively stepped back and promptly tripped over his own feet. One awkward flail later, and Ryan was flopping into the nearby fountain like a fish out of water. The crowd lost it. Laughter echoed across the square as cameras clicked and recorded every second of his soaking wet humiliation. Ryan sputtered, wiping water from his face, only to realize he'd managed to drench not only himself, but a few unlucky bystanders as well. A kid with an ice cream cone burst into tears. Someone shouted, "That's going viral for sure." Dripping and humiliated, Ryan scrambled out of the fountain, his face redder than a double-decker bus. But instead of backing down or, I don't know, learning from the experience, he marched right back toward the guard. His fists were clenched, his soaked sneakers squishing with every step. "What the hell was that for?" he yelled, though the words were half drowned out by the sound of dripping water and the crowd's laughter. And then he did it. The absolute unthinkable. In a move that would surely go down in the "Why did I do that?" Hall of Fame, Ryan shoved the guard square in the chest. Everything went quiet, like eerily quiet. Even the pigeons stopped flapping around. Before Ryan could even think about his next brilliant move, a whole squad of guards appeared out of nowhere, moving in perfect unison. They surrounded him like a well-dressed SWAT team. The crowd started to scatter, people grabbing their kids and backing away, unsure whether to be terrified or entertained. Meanwhile, Ryan was standing there, a mix of anger, confusion, and maybe a little regret flickering across his face. What happened next? Well, let's just say Ryan's adventure didn't end with him touching history. More like history touched him. And not in the way he'd planned. Ryan didn't even have time to process what was happening. One moment, he was standing there soaked, fuming, and indignant. The next, he was being unceremoniously dragged away by two members of palace security. Their grip was firm, not painful, but definitely the kind that said, "You've officially screwed up, buddy. They hauled him past the gawking crowd of tourists, many of whom were still pointing their cameras at him like he was part of some unexpected palace entertainment. "Get in the car, genius!" someone shouted, their tone dripping with mockery. Ryan turned his head, ready to fire back with something equally snarky, but before he could, one of the officers slammed the car door shut in his face. As the car pulled away from the scene, Ryan's mind raced. "This is a misunderstanding," he exclaimed, his voice bouncing around the cramped interior of the police vehicle. "I didn't even mean to." "Save it for the station," one of the officers muttered, not even bothering to look at him. The other didn't say a word, his stoic expression making Ryan's stomach churn with unease. By the time they reached the police station, Ryan had fully entered damage control mode. As they led him into the interrogation room, he couldn't help but notice how sterile and intimidating the place felt. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold, clinical glow over the room. Two officers sat across from him. One was a tall, no-nonsense type, with a face that looked like it hadn't cracked a smile in years. The other was shorter, stockier, and flipping through a notebook like he was reading Ryan's life story. "All right, Mr. Ryan," the tall one began, his British accent crisp and sharp. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Ryan leaned forward, trying his best to seem cooperative, and maybe just a little charming. "Look, this is all just one big joke gone wrong. I mean, come on, it's not like I hurt anyone. The guy didn't even flinch." The shorter officer glanced up from his notes, his expression unimpressed. "You're aware you touched a member of the Royal Guard, correct?" "Well, yeah, but it was barely a nudge. I mean, the guy's wearing one of those massive hats. I thought he'd—" "You thought wrong," the tall officer interrupted, his tone icy. "Do you understand that what you did constitutes assault on a representative of the Crown?" Ryan blinked. Assault? Representative of the Crown? This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, right? "Wait, hold on," he said, raising his hands. "You're telling me that a little tap on the shoulder is considered assault? I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. It was—" "A violation," the tall officer finished for him, "and under British law, it's taken very seriously." Ryan was left alone in a holding cell not long after. The room was everything you'd expect from a police station: small, gray, and depressing. The walls were scuffed and stained, and the bench he sat on was as cold as his current mood. In one corner, something unidentifiable and unpleasant-looking sat on the floor. He made a mental note to keep his distance. He tried to stay optimistic. This had to be one of those things that got sorted out quickly, right? A slap on the wrist, a stern warning, and then he'd be back at his Airbnb telling the story of that time I accidentally annoyed the Royal Guard. But when the cell door creaked open, it wasn't to let him out. Two men stepped inside, both dressed in sharp, dark suits that screamed official business. One introduced himself as a representative from the U.S. Embassy. The other was a lawyer, and not the friendly, everything's going to be fine kind. Mr. Ryan, the lawyer began, adjusting his tie, "let me be clear. You're in serious trouble. What you did is considered an attack on a symbol of British authority, and the Crown does not take these matters lightly." Ryan felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. "It was a joke," he said, his voice a little quieter now. "A really bad joke, I'll admit, but still." "Bad joke or not," the embassy representative cut in, "you've put yourself in a position where cooperation is your best option. The UK doesn't mess around with these kinds of incidents. You need to take this seriously." Ryan swallowed hard. For the first time, it really hit him how far he'd fallen from his carefree tourist antics just hours ago. The lawyer continued talking, outlining potential fines, legal proceedings, and even a possible court date. It was like something out of a nightmare, or a really bad episode of a reality show. As they left the room, Ryan slumped back against the wall of the cell. His signature bravado was gone, replaced by a sinking feeling in his chest. The weight of his actions was finally catching up to him, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how he was going to talk his way out of this one. By the time the evening rolled around, Ryan felt like he was starring in the most bizarre episode of his life, one he'd never agreed to film. Sitting alone in the cold, gray cell, he replayed every second of the incident in his head. "What was I thinking?" he thought, staring at the ceiling. He didn't mean for things to spiral this far out of control. What started as a harmless joke had somehow turned into an international fiasco. It wasn't just the police anymore. The media had latched onto the story like seagulls on a dropped sandwich. Every so often, Ryan could hear the muffled chaos of reporters crowding the front of the police station, cameras flashing and microphones shoved at anyone in uniform. Through the glass of the officer's room, he caught a glimpse of a news broadcast. His face was plastered on the screen alongside a headline that made him cringe. "American tourist attacks the Queen's Guard." "Attacks?" he muttered to himself, groaning. "All I did was poke the guy." Eventually, the guards came for him. They didn't say much, just gestured for him to follow. Ryan braced himself as they led him into a dimly lit interrogation room. Sitting at the table was a man who looked like he'd just stepped out of a history book, perfectly pressed military uniform, medals gleaming, and an expression that screamed, "Don't waste my time." The man introduced himself as Captain Hughes, head of the palace security team. His tone was as sharp as his appearance. "No, Mr. Ryan, let's cut to the chase," he said, leaning forward. "Your actions today have caused quite the stir, both here and abroad." Ryan swallowed hard, trying not to look as panicked as he felt. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was just a joke." "Save the excuses," Captain Hughes interrupted. "Here's the deal. The palace is willing to consider leniency, but only if you issue a public apology, a sincere apology." Ryan's eyebrows shot up. "Public? Like cameras and everything?" The captain's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, cameras and everything. The people need to see that you understand the gravity of what you've done." Ryan slumped back in his chair, letting out a long breath. This wasn't exactly the grand London adventure he'd envisioned when he boarded that flight, but at this point, he didn't have much of a choice. He nodded reluctantly. "All right, let's get this over with." They didn't waste any time. Within the hour, Ryan was being escorted back to the scene of the incident. The moment he stepped out of the police car, he was greeted by a wall of noise. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked furiously, and a crowd of onlookers had gathered behind the barriers, their energy electric with anticipation. As he was led to the spot in front of the guards, Ryan felt the heat of 100 lenses trained on him. The same guards he'd messed with earlier stood stoically in their iconic uniforms, their expressions unreadable. It was surreal, like being the main character in a play he hadn't rehearsed for. The officer beside him gave a slight nudge. "Whenever you're ready." Ryan cleared his throat, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'd like to apologize," he began, his voice shaky. "To the Royal Guard, to the people of London, and to anyone I may have offended. What I did was disrespectful, and I'm truly sorry." There was an awkward pause. A few people in the crowd muttered something. Then, from somewhere in the back, a voice rang out. "Get on your knees." Ryan's heart sank. He glanced nervously at the officers beside him, hoping for some kind of intervention. But they didn't move. Clearly, this wasn't part of the official script. The crowd began to murmur, the demand echoing and gaining momentum. "On your knees!" someone else shouted, followed by a chorus of agreement. Ryan felt his face burn with humiliation. Every instinct told him to refuse, to walk away and let the headlines write themselves. But the weight of the situation and the sheer number of smartphones pointed in his direction left him with no good options. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself to his knees. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, though Ryan could hear a few jeers mixed in for good measure. Somewhere, someone was already uploading the moment to social media, complete with hashtags he didn't want to think about. When it was finally over, Ryan was escorted back to the police car, his head spinning. The crowd was still buzzing as he left, and he could only imagine what kind of headlines would follow. By the time he got back to his Airbnb, the internet had already crowned him as the newest viral sensation. Memes popped up within hours, some mocking, some surprisingly supportive. One particularly popular post featured a photo of him kneeling with the caption, "When you mess with the wrong Queen's Guard." As he scrolled through the chaos on his phone, Ryan let out a heavy sigh. This wasn't the kind of fame he'd ever wanted, but one thing was certain, he'd never forget the lesson he'd learned in London, and he'd definitely steer clear of the Royal Guard from now on. If I were Ryan, I'd be freaking out way sooner. Messing with the Royal Guard? Big mistake, dude. Sure, it started as a prank, but things escalated fast. Dropping to your knees? Yeah, that was a bit much. Anyone else ever had a moment where things went wrong like this? Drop a comment, hit like if you've been there. This story's here to shed light on something real and make the world better. Your opinion matters, so let's hear it.